Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots. Who look at shows, does laser, specials, fossils. I'm a useful idiot, and today I want to talk about Africa in general and why there is a new rush to Africa. And it's very important right now, as we can all see, the focal point in Africa because of all the Western interventions and the threat of so-called Al-Qaeda hotbeds all over Africa, as well as a U.S. showdown with China and all their investments in Africa, resource and land grabs. So Africa is going to be a focal point of U.S. foreign policy for some time to come. And let's look at some of the underlying reasons why. And I hope this doesn't come across as too dry, but I did some research, and there's a lot of interesting articles out there that kind of underline why Africa has become the focal point. A lot of the reasons have already become apparent. Gas and resources and minerals. So let's go into some of the details. So the IMF says that Africa has hosted 6 of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world in the last decade, and that the fastest growing mobile phone penetration rate in the world is in Africa. And this is coupled with the fact that wide-scale armed conflict is supposedly substantially reduced, and that wide-scale poverty is supposedly substantially reduced. And a lot of you might be thinking the same thing I am. It's hard to imagine, with all the armed conflict that we see in Africa, that it's substantially reduced from what it was. But I guess there's enough war going on around there that the relative amount we see now is substantially reduced. And the same thing with poverty. And although I have to say, I've read articles in so-called experts that suggest that our perceptions of Africa are outdated, and that the idea that the entire continent is riddled with poverty and disease is misleading. So anyway, as we know, economic growth in Africa is driven by demand for Africa's resources and raw materials. 3/4 of their exports are unprocessed primary commodities. And of course, they've been benefiting from the fact that the prices of all these unprocessed primary commodities have been hitting record highs in 2012. So China alone, in recent years, has accounted for 40% of the growth in global oil demand, and a lot of that is coming from Africa. And in fact, 20 times more cars in China now than there was 10 years ago, and that's where a lot of their oil demand is coming from. And I always like that 10-year increment figure because as a historian, as I often like to say, 10-year increments seem to be exponential growth periods in this modern era we live in. The 20th century was notable that when you think of the 10-year increments in parts of the 19th century and the 20th century, huge exponential leaps in culture happen in 10-year periods. So I think we're going to continue to see that. And that's why a lot of times when I make projections about policies and technologies and tactics, looking forward 10 years can bring profound changes. A good example of that is the shift in the military paradigm and what will be required of U.S. forces in tactics strategy in the future. So when we look ahead in 10 years, it's going to be a dramatic change. But anyway, I digress. So in the post-9/11 world, the U.S. actively pursued oil and resources from Africa to diversify its resources. Once again, the U.S. felt vulnerable and wanted to find more backup sources for resources and turned to Africa in the post-9/11 world. And let me remind you, that is also a 10-year increment. So now we find ourselves 10 years forward. And all this investment and all this exploitation of resources in Africa the last 10 years is really paying off. And that's why we're seeing more and more activity there. And a good example is a country like Angola. They are China's largest single source of oil imports and the 9th largest supplier of oil to the United States. So Angola is a big oil player for both the United States and China. And in the last 10 years, Angola has had the fastest growing economy in the world. And that in spite of a civil war not too long ago. But as usual, there's a lot of corruption in Angola. Politicians have net worths of $100 million apiece because of them siphoning off money from foreign aid. But one expert was quoted as saying China does not carry the colonial baggage of the Western powers in Africa, giving it a soft power advantage in its relationship with Africa, unquote. And I agree with that. China's had a huge advantage, plus the fact that China doesn't necessarily go in there and give foreign aid. They'd like to trade resources for infrastructure deals. So they like to go in there and help these countries build infrastructure, build companies, build hydroelectric dams, and schools and the like. So the U.S. is lagging behind there. So then, but one difference, of course, is that with U.S. and transnational companies, they are private, whereas when Chinese companies get involved in Africa, they are state-owned. So it's definitely a strategic play by China. And interestingly enough, the former president of Botswana said that he preferred to deal with the Chinese as they treated Africans as equals. And I could see where that would be true. The Western powers, being the former colonial powers, still tend to look upon African leaders as corrupt, fumbling kleptocrats, which pretty much they mostly are. So one could hardly argue that point. So you look at across Africa, we have lots of resources available to Western powers, and now the scramble goes on. And it's generally around diamonds, oil, water, and gold, which are certainly the coin of the realm globally. But we have the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has theoretically $24 trillion worth of unexploited minerals. We have Zambia, once again, like Angola, providing lots of resources for China, including copper. Although there's a lot of problems in Zambia for China, because they were actually using exploitive labor in Zambia, which is rather interesting considering we consider U.S. jobs going to China as being exploitive labor in China, and then China outsources work to Zambia and exploits the workers there. And they had incidents where Chinese management were firing on shooting strikers, so they have a soured relationship there. And interestingly, Hillary Clinton showed up there just before a recent election and said she did not want to see a new colonialism in Africa, and criticized China for its support of dictatorial regimes, which of course is ironic, coming from Hillary Clinton, knowing that the United States is the one that's interested in new colonialism in Africa, and it should be criticized for supporting dictatorial regimes all over Africa as well as the Middle East. So the U.S. and China are not the only players in Africa, though we also have India, Brazil, South Korea, and Turkey all active there as well. And it's not always about diamonds, oil, water, and gold, and minerals, and natural gas, and the like. Sometimes it's about farmland. And many African countries are selling a lot of farmland to multinationals and foreign governments. And this, of course, is the biofuel industry, and it only drives prices up as food production is reduced, and it creates a lot of unrest and, of course, a lot of expenses. And so we see this cycle again where we have corporate interests coming in and creating conditions where food prices go up, and this creates a cycle of unrest. So we'll see more of that in Africa as well. But it also begs the question, we constantly see famine across Africa, and yet we're going to have crops raised in Africa for biofuels instead of feeding a continent constantly struck with famine. So that begs that question. And the other thing is that a lot of the profits from multinationals, of course, go outside of Africa and not reinvested in Africa. And that's one advantage that China has on the United States and the Western powers thus far. So then we have another layer, because we have all these international, multinational, and American companies that play African countries off of each other to get sweetheart deals. For example, Nigeria has been an important provider of oil to the United States, and now they've had problems dealing with their unrest and also the undermining infrastructure is dilapidating, and they are not reinvesting. So they are having problems competing. So American transnational companies are moving out of Nigeria and moving to other African countries. And it also has to do with access being difficult. Chinese companies are all investing in Eastern Africa, where they have a lot of easier access. And I have attached a map that shows all the Chinese investments throughout Africa, so you can see exactly why we have this dynamic playing out of America trying to counter Chinese interest in Africa, which is certainly the umbrella under which all the other developments in Africa have to be considered. That is the unifying factor in Africa right now, is a showdown between the United States, Europe, and China in resource and land grabs in Africa. And it's also turns out that there's been 70 discoveries in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 5 years, especially Tanzania, Uganda, and Mozambique. Over 250 trillion cubic feet of natural gas just in those 3 countries alone. So that's certainly spurring a lot of Western interest as well. If you look in sub-Saharan Africa, all the areas below the North African regions that are more desert and that we're seeing a lot of unrest in right now, in the last 5 years we have 70 discoveries of oil and natural gas. So that's going to drive a lot of interest in Africa. And as it also turns out, China has had a monopoly on rare earth metals, which in our technological age are having more and more and more importance. And China pretty much had an 80–90% monopoly on the rare earth metals. But now, as it turns out, there may be a plethora of rare earth metals in Africa. So certainly the United States would like to be able to access that to counter China's monopoly on these rare earth metals. And then the other thing that's interesting about Africa is 70% of the populations across Africa are under 24. So there's a huge untapped labor force there as well. So if more economic growth could be created in Africa and more stability, there might be a chance to create more cheap manufacturing base that maybe all of Asia will, wages will rise as they develop, and they will outsource all their cheap labor to Africa. How about that for a theory? And so anyway, this is how it goes now. This is why we have all this attention on Africa now, and that's without going into, of course, all the uranium in North Africa that both France and America access, and then all the oil that's already known all over North Africa. So this is just completing the picture of a resource land grab across Africa, now encompassing the entire continent and a recolonization. So there you have it. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.